Do you own a cam? Does the amount of H2O they need make your house into a water park? Does the fact that your house is now the new summer attraction for all the neighborhood kids stress you out to the point where you want to pull your hair out and or jump off a cliff? Fret no more! Magical Cams has the solution for you. Introducing DIY drainage trays! What up everybody, Dylan with Magical Cams here. In today's video, I'm showing you how to make DIY drainage trays. So, when I made this cam rack, I was very limited with the amount of space for drainage after I had all the lights installed and everything else. So, all the drainage trays on the market or anything similar, doing any ways that I've shown in previous videos were just not gonna work. So, I went by my local hardware store and I think I spent about 40 bucks on each one, and they came out amazingly. I've been using these for almost 2 months now and I've not seen any issues. So if you are limited with the amount of space, or maybe the drainage tray doesn't fit on the rack perfectly, for example, this is a 48-inch rack, but with the bars, it's a little less than 48 inches wide. So I'm gonna show you how to make these. So just fasten your seatbelt and get ready for the ride. So the first thing here is some blueprints, so y'all can kind of understand where I'm starting from. So the drainage trays that I needed to fit on a 48-inch wide by 18-inch in depth by, I believe it's 6 foot in height, baker's rack. Now, in order to fit a drainage tray there, between the bars and everything, it needed to be 45 inches in width, 18 inches in depth, and then since I used 1x2s for this build, that ended up being 1.5 inches in height. So yeah, as I said, my materials were some pine 1x2s and then some 1/4-inch particle board. Now this is the kind that typically goes on like the back of like a desk or some other sort of furniture. You can use plywood if you want. I just found this for a cheaper price because they were scrap cuts. So yeah, if you need the same size drainage trays, go ahead and pause the video on these blueprints to kind of get an idea of what materials you'll need and what size to cut your lumber and everything like that. Okay, so getting into the build here, I first gather all of my materials, which includes the cut lumber, and then I'm using 2 types of wood screws here, and I'll show you the sizes as we go along in the video. And then I have some clamps which will hold down the pieces in place while I screw them together. I have a drill, some drill bits, and then a Phillips head bit for the drill so I can screw in the screws. And then the last things, which I actually don't have in this section of the video, is some Flex Seal liquid in the color black, and then a paintbrush to apply the Flex Seal. So the first thing I'm going to want to do here is create a frame using the 1x2s. I go ahead and clamp the pieces of wood down. Now the smaller piece of 1x2 goes in between the longer pieces, and then I use a scrap piece of wood to make sure that those 2 pieces are square so that when I drill them together, they are not crooked. So you can see here what I'm doing is finding a drill bit that will be smaller than the threads on the screw and not too large, and I'm going to drill some pilot holes for those screws so that I don't split the wood, and then after that I go ahead and screw in my screws. These are number 8 1 1/4 inch screws. Now at this point, if you hear the wood splitting, you want to make sure that you pull the screw out and drill a little bit larger of a hole. That way you don't mess up your frame. So you can see here, this is the first completed side. There's still 3 sides that I will need to complete, and I will use the same method as before to complete those 3 remaining sides. So again, make sure you clamp this down so that when you're drilling in these screws, the pieces of the 1x2 don't shift. So once you get all 4 pieces together, then you should have a frame, and it's going to look a little something like this. At this point, I made sure that the frame fit on the shelves on the rack, and I suggest you do the same before you continue to make sure that your measurements and your dimensions are correct. Now it's time to attach the bottom. If you're unsure of what side to attach the bottom to, I would choose the flatter side so that the bottom sits as flushly as possible with the frame. But again, if you're using all 1x2s and you've followed the directions to a T at this point, both sides should be exactly the same. So then the way I attach the bottom is by using number 8 1-inch screws. And then I go ahead and drill pilot holes the same way for those. However, with these pilot holes, I want to make sure that I don't drill the pilot holes all the way through the 1x2. So I go ahead and take a piece of tape and mark off where a good place to stop drilling in the wood is. So in this case, I have 1.5 inches to work with, so I want to drill about 1 inch in, which is also the same depth as the length of the screw. So again, I go ahead and get the bottom squared up on this frame, and then I clamp it down to make sure that it doesn't move while I'm drilling the pieces together. So a little tip here. When you drill in this bottom, you need to be careful not to drill over the screws that are holding the frame together. So use caution when drilling the bottom on and make sure that you don't screw in more screws over where the other ones holding the frame are. So once you have all of your screws screwed in, it should look a little something like this. If you use something like plywood, you'll have a better time getting the screws flush. Otherwise, if you use the same material that I used, you can go ahead and countersink. For those that don't know, countersinking is essentially sinking the screw head into the wood so that it sits flush in the lumber, and you can essentially put some like wood putty or similar over the screw and completely hide it. However, I didn't find it necessary. First off, this is going to be on the bottom and nobody's going to see it. It doesn't need to be perfect. And the only thing that I was trying to accomplish with the screws was making sure that the bottom was held on. By adding the flex seal in the next step, that's going to add a lot of strength to holding the 1x2s and bottom together. So now it's a time to apply the flex seal liquid. Before applying the flex seal liquid, I go ahead and use some frog tape to tape off any parts of the drainage tray where I don't want the flex seal. And I'm going to end up painting those parts later, and we'll get to that. When I first started out doing this, I started by using a paintbrush, which was a bit of a task. So I found it easiest to just pour on the flex seal liquid and then distribute the flex seal evenly throughout the drainage tray with the paintbrush. So this next part is extraordinarily important. When distributing the flex seal throughout the drainage tray, I made sure to have thick layers between the 1x2s and the bottom. Sealing the bottom of that tray is the most important part of this because that's what's going to be taking on the most pressure from all of the water sitting in the tray. So just make sure that you really get in there and fill those gaps. So after that first coat went ahead and cured, which was after about 24 hours, I went ahead and applied a second coat. And now in this coat, again, I make sure that all of the gaps between the 1x2s and the bottom are nicely sealed. And then I make sure that any exposed wood was covered. And at this point, I found that covering the sides of the 1x2 were a lot easier. All right, so now it is time to paint the rest of the drainage tray. Now, you don't necessarily have to paint it, but the reason I chose to paint it was so that it looks clean, but also since there might be some overspray from the chameleon cages here, the wood might be exposed to water. And the last thing I want is to have this wood exposed to water and then expand and get swollen from the water, because at that point the drainage trays probably won't last very long. The next thing I'm painting here is some square dowels. The purpose of these is to allow the enclosures to be raised off of the bottom of the drainage trays so that the enclosures are not sitting in standing water. And the reason I've chosen to keep these separate is because I can use them interchangeably with different size dowels if I want to use a different size enclosure on the drainage trays, or if they get damaged and then I need to replace them, then I can do that as well. Another reason I used these was because they were super thin, which allowed me to fit the enclosures in the space that I had. Alrighty, and then here is the finished drainage tray. After everything was cured, I went ahead and made sure that it held water. And it was a great success. So once I made sure that the tray held water, I went ahead and placed it on the rack and then wiggled in the cages till they sat in the bottom of the drainage trays. So if you're wondering, these are the Zoom Med Rep Debris small enclosures, which have a depth of 16 inches. So with the blueprints that I did and the measurements I took, they fit just perfectly. Once the enclosures were in place, I went ahead and slid the dowels underneath the enclosures to raise them off the drainage tray. Alrighty, so I am getting very close to being done here. The next step I need to address is making sure that the enclosures themselves will actually drain. At this point, as is, they do not drain. And my solution to that is by drilling tiny holes in the plastic floors. And after I drilled those holes, I went ahead and placed the bottoms back in. And I don't know if you can actually see these very well, but there are a bunch of tiny holes throughout the floors here. By now you might have noticed, well, hey, how am I going to pull out the floors in order to clean them with the drainage tray in the way of the service door? So I did not plan to have the service doors open from the get-go. If you want to, you can plan to incorporate a shorter lip on the drainage tray. I did not, because I wanted to make sure that these held as much water as possible, and that was just an extra sawing step that I really didn't find necessary. Anyway, my simple solution to this is by taking a suction cup and pulling out the floor with it. Now, I don't know about you, but I have tons of these types of things laying around that I haven't used because I don't have any use for them until now. The suction cup did work. However, it was kind of annoying to have to be able to pull that floor out with the plants and everything else inside the enclosure. So I found that the easiest method was to actually pull the service door out of the enclosure by just pressing against the sides and pulling out the service door from the hinges. And I know you can do this with the Rep Debris that are larger than the small ones like this. However, I know you cannot do it on the Nanos. All right, well, I hope that made a lot of sense. As you're building these two, you'll figure out what works for you, maybe what materials work better, and once you start building it, you'll have a little better understanding of how it all comes together. So if you have any questions about my drainage trays, or you have questions about the ones you want to make, go ahead and message me on Instagram. It's @magicalcams, facebook.com/magicalcams, or you can reach out via email. That is magicalcams@gmail.com. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Help me out a lot. Like the video. That would also help me out a lot. And I'm excited to also announce that in the last month, I've launched magicalcams.com. So you can go and learn about what Magical Cam is about. You can learn a little bit more about me and my passion for the hobby and how that manifested. And you can also check out the available cams and purchase one if you'd like. Yeah, so that's exciting. At least go check it out, and I put a lot of work into it, so I'm pretty pleased with it. But anyway, have an amazing day. I've been thinking about how, and then I came across a bit of a conundrum with, or just